I quit my job for us." I said those words with a mixture of fear and excitement, believing I was making the bravest choice of my life, believing in a man who smirked back at me as if he knew something I didn't. And maybe he did, because that smirk would haunt me long after the moment passed, long after I packed up my office and handed in my badge, long after I threw myself into the role of supportive wife, homemaker, and dream chaser at his side, convinced that love meant sacrifice, that my degree and my steady paycheck could be put on hold because we were building something together, weren't we? A future where he would thrive in his career and I would hold us steady through the chaos. Except the truth was that his idea of us never matched mine, and I only realized it too late, when the bills piled up, when his late nights grew longer, when his smirk widened into laughter at my naivety. But I didn't crumble, not fully, because hidden behind his back and hidden behind my smile was something he never imagined, the quiet discipline of a secret account, small, deposits scraped together month after month, untraceable, unseen, waiting like an ember ready to ignite when the time came. And the time would come, sooner than either of us expected, in a way that turned his smirk into silence and his arrogance into fear. Because what he didn't know was that I had been preparing for his betrayal long before he delivered it. He came home that night with the same cocky tilt of his head, the smirk plastered on his face like it had been carved there, dropping his bag by the door and tossing his jacket on the couch without so much as a glance in my direction. And I remember thinking how quickly respect can disappear in a marriage, how fast someone can take for granted the sacrifices made for them, because he looked at me not as a partner who had given up her independence to support him, but as a convenience, someone who would cook, clean, and smile politely at dinner parties. While he boasted about his success that looked more like debt notices shoved into drawers and unopened emails piling up in his inbox, while I quietly adjusted the budget, cut corners, and pretended not to notice how reckless he was being, but I noticed everything. I kept every receipt, every statement, every late fee, and though he thought I was blind, though he thought I was too trusting to see the cracks in his empire, I was already building my own foundation beneath his, one he could never touch. And I told myself over and over, don't react, don't confront, just prepare, because I knew his smirk wasn't confidence. It was a mask, and one day that mask would slip, and when it did, I would be ready, not with tears or begging, but with a truth so sharp it would cut him to the bone. And the best part was he wouldn't see it coming, because men like him never do. The first time I truly understood the depth of his arrogance was during a dinner with his colleagues, men in suits who spoke too loudly and drank too much wine, and he introduced me with that same smirk, not as the woman who gave up her career to support him, but as the one who takes care of the house now, and the way they laughed, raising their glasses, made my stomach burn, but I didn't let it show. I smiled politely, even when he joked about how I couldn't handle the pressure of my old job, and the table erupted like it was the funniest thing they'd ever heard, while inside me something hardened, something unshakable, because I had handled more pressure than he ever could, balancing my career, our bills, his whims, and now his debts. And in that moment, I realized he didn't just take me for granted. He belittled me in front of others to inflate himself, and that was unforgivable. But I swallowed the humiliation. I tucked it away with all the other moments. The texts I'd seen pop up on his phone late at night, the unexplained charges on our account, the sudden business trips that left me alone for days. All of it filed away in my mind, and in a quiet ledger only I knew existed, a record of every time he thought he was untouchable. Because I knew the truth. The higher he climbed on his fragile ego, the further he would fall when the foundation crumbled, and I was the only one who knew exactly when and how that would happen. Because unlike him, I had been saving, watching, and planning with the patience of someone who had nothing left to lose, but everything left to prove. The shift became undeniable when his late nights stopped being explained at all. No more flimsy excuses about last-minute meetings or project deadlines. Just silence when I asked. Silence followed by that smirk as he scrolled through his phone, and the truth sat heavy in my chest, though I didn't yet have proof, but proof wasn't what I needed. Not yet. What I needed was discipline, the kind of discipline that had me taking a small portion of every grocery run in cash and tucking it into an envelope, then moving those envelopes into my secret account once a month, always in odd amounts so it would look like nothing more than random ATM deposits if anyone ever looked. And over the years, those deposits grew into something solid, something mine, something untouchable, while he spent his paychecks on flashy dinners, overpriced gadgets, and networking trips that somehow always involved champagne and resort photos on his coworkers' feeds, though he swore they weren't his, and I said nothing, not even when the credit card bill arrived with charges from places we had never been together, not even when his boss's wife accidentally let it slip that he had shown up to a company gala alone because his wife didn't fit the vibe. And I smiled through the ache because I knew the power of silence. Because silence made him confident, and his confidence made him careless. And careless men leave trails. Trails of receipts, trails of texts, trails of whispers they think will never reach your ears. But every trail he left became another reason to keep building my escape. Another reminder that when the day came, I wouldn't just leave with nothing, I would leave with everything he never thought I could have. And while he smirked at my supposed dependence, he didn't realize I was already free. Already planning the life I would live after him. The life where his debts and lies couldn't touch me. The life where his smirk would fade into memory and mine would finally begin. The breaking point didn't arrive with a bang, not at first. It crept in slowly, like water seeping under a locked door, impossible to stop once it started. And the moment I finally saw him for what he was came on an ordinary Thursday afternoon when I logged into the joint account to pay. The electric bill and the numbers didn't add up because we weren't just a little short this time. The balance was almost gone, drained in a matter of weeks. Thousands evaporated like smoke. And for the first time in years, my hand trembled on the mouse. Not out of fear of losing money, but out of rage at his audacity. Because this wasn't carelessness anymore. This was deliberate. This was theft dressed up as partnership, and I sat there staring at the empty account while he sat across town, no doubt sipping whiskey and laughing with someone who believed his lies. And I felt something snap, something final, because I realized I had been clinging to the idea of us long after he had abandoned it. I had been living in a marriage, where only one person was sacrificing while the other consumed without guilt, and suddenly my silence no longer felt like strength. It felt like complicity, and I knew the time had come to stop waiting, to stop letting him think he was untouchable, because in truth he was already standing on quicksand, and I was the only one who could decide whether to throw him a rope or simply watch him sink, and the decision crystallized in that moment, sharp and unyielding. I would end it, not with screams or confrontations he could twist back on me, but with documentation, with cold facts, with the kind of evidence no smirk could erase. So I pulled out the folder I'd been building quietly for years, the one he didn't know existed, filled with bank statements, screenshots of texts, credit, card bills, hotel receipts, even whispers from neighbors and colleagues who thought they were telling me harmless stories. All of it laid out in black and white, and I felt calm for the first time in months. Maybe years, because I saw the shape of my escape forming before me. Not a fantasy, not a someday, but a plan, a roadmap out of his chaos and into my own life again. And while he strutted around believing I was trapped, I was already 3 steps ahead because my secret account was no longer just an emergency fund. It was a weapon, and I intended to use it carefully, strategically, in a way that would strip him of the power he had wielded so carelessly. And when the day came, the day I chose, his smirk wouldn't just fade, it would die on his lips, and he would finally understand what it meant to underestimate the woman who had been watching, saving, and preparing all along. That day came faster than I thought, though not in the way I expected. It started with a phone call from the bank, a polite but firm voice asking to verify unusual activity on our joint account. And as I listened, pen in hand, the numbers they read out felt like blows. Charges totaling nearly $10,000 over the span of 2 weeks, spread across luxury hotels, jewelry stores, and high-end restaurants, none of which I had set foot in. And my stomach twisted, not with surprise because I had known this was coming, but with the sharp recognition that the moment had arrived sooner than I planned. And when I hung up, I didn't cry. I didn't even speak. I simply opened my laptop and began moving, shifting the final portion of funds from my secret account into a safe, untouchable certificate I had set up in my own name months earlier, locking it where no one, not even him, could reach it. And then I gathered my folder, the years of quiet evidence, slid it into a leather bag, and drove to meet the lawyer whose card I had been keeping hidden in the bottom of my desk drawer. A woman who had once been a colleague and who knew exactly what men like my husband thought they could get away with. And I sat across from her, my voice steady as I laid it all out. Every late payment, every unexplained withdrawal, every screenshot. And when she looked up at me with sharp eyes and said, "You've been preparing for this for a long time," I only nodded because I had. And together we mapped out every detail, every step, how the accounts would be frozen, how the property would be divided, how the debts he thought he could bury would come to light. And for the first time, I felt the weight lift, because I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't reacting. I was acting. I was in control. And when I returned home that night and saw him lounging on the couch, smirk still glued to his face as if nothing in the world could touch him, I almost laughed. Because the papers were already in motion, the locks already turning, and he had no idea that by the end of the month his smirk would vanish and his empire of lies would collapse, leaving me not broken, but free. And when that moment arrived, when the lawyer slid the documents across the polished table and the judge looked down at him, it wasn't me who looked small or defeated. It was him, because my secret account, my hidden weapon, had ended it all, and his smirk, the smirk I had lived under for far too long, finally disappeared for good. He didn't realize what was happening until it was too late, until the papers were served and the accounts were frozen, until his card was declined at a gas station and he came storming through the front door demanding to know what I had done, his voice raised, his face red, but all I felt was calm, because I had expected this moment, rehearsed it in my mind for years. And instead of yelling back, I simply placed the folder on the table and slid it toward him, the same folder he didn't even know existed. And as he flipped through the pages, his smirk faltered for the first time, his hands trembling just slightly, as the weight of his own lies stared back at him in black and white. And I didn't have to say a word because the silence said it all. The silence of every bill I had paid, every debt I had carried, every night I had sat alone while he wasted what we had. And finally he looked up, his arrogance cracked, and asked, "How long have you been planning this?" And I met his eyes with a steady gaze and answered simply, "Long enough." And that was when the fight drained out of him, because he knew I had won before the battle even began. And in the days that followed, as lawyers called, as creditors, circled, as his colleagues whispered, I walked with a quiet strength he couldn't touch. The strength of someone who had been underestimated for too long. And when the judge finally signed the order, dividing what was left and protecting what I had built, I felt not triumph but release. Because revenge wasn't about destroying him. It was about reclaiming myself. And as I closed the door on that chapter of my life, his smirk nothing more than a fading memory, I realized that my secret account hadn't just ended my marriage, it had saved me and given me the chance to begin again on my own terms, with no one left to smirk at me ever again. The fallout was like watching a storm roll in over open water. Slow at first, then all-consuming. His smirk, once his permanent armor, cracked into disbelief the morning he realized his car, technically registered in both our names, was no longer in the driveway. I had transferred it to my possession through the lawyer before he even knew what was happening. He tried calling the bank, shouting into the phone about fraud, demanding they reverse the freezes, but every door he knocked on was already locked. Every account he thought he controlled had been dismantled. Every safety net he assumed I didn't understand was now tangled tight around him. I stayed silent through it all, watching him unravel, because the truth was, he didn't know how to survive without someone else cushioning his fall. The colleagues he once bragged to at those dinners stopped calling. His business partners backed away when they saw his financial mess laid bare in legal filings. Even his own family, the ones who once praised him for being so ambitious, began asking me quietly what had happened, their voices low with embarrassment, as if they'd always known he wasn't as successful as he pretended but didn't want to admit it. I didn't gloat. I didn't humiliate him publicly. I let the documents speak, let the evidence carry the weight I had borne for years. And while he scrambled, I moved with deliberate care. I signed a lease on a small but beautiful apartment overlooking the river, paid entirely with funds from the account he never knew existed. I bought new furniture, not extravagant, but mine, every piece chosen without his smirk hanging over my shoulder. At night, I lay in my bed and felt a peace so foreign I almost didn't recognize it. The kind of peace that comes when you finally stop waiting for someone else to value you and decide to value yourself instead. The irony was, he thought I couldn't live without him, but the truth was, he couldn't live without me. He had built his image on my silence, his lifestyle on my sacrifices, his smirk on my endurance. And when I took that away, when I finally walked out with proof and preparation instead of tears, he had nothing left. I still remember the last time I saw him in court, slouched in a chair, the smirk gone, his face pale as the judge read the final orders. He looked up at me, maybe searching for pity, maybe hoping for one last shred of the woman who once believed in him, but I gave him nothing, because I wasn't that woman anymore. I wasn't the wife who quit her job for us. I was the woman who built her own safety net in secret and then used it to cut free. And as I walked out of that courthouse, papers in hand, sunlight on my face, I knew I hadn't just ended a marriage. I had ended years of being diminished by a smirk, years of swallowing humiliation, years of letting someone else decide my worth. My secret bank account hadn't just ended it all. It had given me back everything I thought I lost. And for the first time in forever, the smile on my face was real. The aftermath unfolded like a quiet revelation, not dramatic or explosive, but steady, irreversible, like dominoes tipping one by one. He tried, of course, tried to bargain, tried to swagger his way through meetings with lawyers, even tried to corner me once in the parking lot, his voice low and sharp as he hissed that I would regret this. But his eyes gave him away, darting, nervously because he knew he had lost control, and I didn't flinch. I stood there with my keys in my hand, calm as stone, and told him, "You already regret it more than I ever will." After that, he didn't try again, not directly. Instead, the stories started to drift back to me from mutual acquaintances. How he was selling off possessions to cover debts, how the colleagues who once clinked glasses with him at expensive dinners now avoided his calls, how the women he thought admired him melted away the moment his credit card stopped working. I didn't celebrate his collapse. I didn't need to. Watching his empire crumble without me lifting a finger was enough. Meanwhile, my life quietly blossomed. I found myself waking early, making coffee in my little Riverview apartment, sitting by the window with a notebook, and writing down plans for the future. No smirks, no belittling comments, no one watching over my shoulder. Just me, steady and whole. I reconnected with old friends, the ones he once rolled his eyes at, and I realized how much of myself I had let shrink to fit into his narrow definition of wife. Each week felt like another layer of dust shaken off. Another reminder that I hadn't disappeared when I quit my job. I had simply been buried, waiting. And when I finally signed on to a new position, not in the exact field I left, but one that excited me in ways I hadn't felt in years, I felt stronger than I ever had. My secret account wasn't just money anymore. It was proof that I had trusted myself even when he didn't, that I had believed in my own strength even when he laughed at me. And when I look back now, the memory of his smirk doesn't sting. It almost makes me smile, because I know it was the very thing that fueled me, the thing that pushed me to prepare, to be smarter, to be patient. He thought that smirk made him untouchable, but it was the rope he tied around his own neck. And I, the woman he underestimated most, was the one who finally let him hang from it. By the time the dust truly settled, the man who once strutted through our home like a king was reduced to whispers in the corners of social circles, his name spoken with pity rather than admiration. He had no idea how fast reputation dies once the facade cracks. His colleagues moved on to shinier protégés, his so-called friends stopped returning calls, and even his family, who once praised him and turned a blind eye to his arrogance, quietly shifted their loyalty, suddenly remembering every story I had once told them, every slight they had dismissed. They called me now with soft voices, testing the waters, saying things like, "We didn't realize how bad it was," and "You were stronger than we gave you credit for." I didn't gloat, but I didn't let them rewrite history either. I answered politely and kept my distance because I had learned the value of boundaries, of protecting what I had rebuilt. And rebuilt I did, brick by brick, quietly, steadily, with no need for applause. My apartment transformed into a sanctuary. Warm light, bookshelves filled with stories I finally had time to read, walls free of tension and silence heavy with resentment. I spent weekends exploring the city like it was new, lingering in coffee shops, walking along the river, rediscovering the joy of being alone without being lonely. I started therapy too, because I didn't want to carry his shadow into the next chapter of my life. In those sessions, I peeled back years of swallowing my voice, years of accepting less than I deserved, and the woman who emerged was not someone who would ever quit her job for a man again, not because I didn't believe in love, but because I believed in myself more. Meanwhile, I heard through the grapevine that he had moved into a small rental on the outskirts of town, the kind of place he once mocked others for living in. The irony wasn't lost on me. He had laughed at me for saving, for planning, for being paranoid about money. But those very habits were the reason I walked away free while he drowned in his own carelessness. The smirk that once defined him was gone, replaced with the hollow look of someone who realized too late that arrogance doesn't pay bills and charm doesn't erase debt. And every time I passed the courthouse steps where I had walked out free, papers in hand, sunlight on my face, I reminded myself of one simple truth. His downfall was never my goal. My freedom was, and I had achieved it. The months that followed were quieter than I ever imagined, not because life slowed down, but because the constant hum of tension that had once filled every room was gone. For years I had lived on edge, bracing myself for the sound of his key in the door, for the smirk that told me he'd spent what we couldn't afford, for the dismissive laugh when I asked about our future. Now, when I turned the key to my own place, all I found was peace, the steady tick of a clock, the aroma of fresh coffee, the simple joy of silence that belonged only to me. It was strange at first, waking up without the weight of him, but slowly I realized I didn't miss him at all. I missed myself, the version of me I had tucked away to keep him comfortable. And she was coming back, piece by piece, every time I said no to things I didn't want, every time I smiled without checking if someone approved. My lawyer called me once to update me on the final filings, her voice almost amused when she said, "He's still trying to fight, but he has nothing left to fight with." I thanked her, hung up, and laughed for the first time in months. Not a bitter laugh, but a light one, because the image of his smirk colliding with reality was almost poetic. Meanwhile, I found myself dreaming again, something I hadn't allowed myself to do in years. I took a class just for fun, joined a hiking group, even started sketching again late at night like I used to in college. Every dollar I had saved, every careful decision I made in secret, had bought me more than freedom. It bought me the space to imagine, to create, to live without apology. And when people asked if I hated him, if I wanted revenge, I always answered, honestly, no. The greatest revenge had already happened the moment he saw that folder, the moment he realized the woman he dismissed had outsmarted him, outplanned him, and outlasted him. His smirk had been his weapon, but my silence had been mine, and silence won. It was almost poetic how life turned on him in the exact ways he had once mocked others for. The man who had sneered at budget living was now clipping coupons. The man who had smirked when I quit my job was now working shifts beneath the very colleagues he once bragged about outranking. The same women he used to impress with his charm and his dinners vanished when they realized the credit cards no longer worked, leaving him with empty tables and unpaid tabs. I didn't need to see it to know. I heard enough from whispers, from mutual acquaintances who couldn't resist, sharing updates. Every story only confirmed what I already knew. Arrogance always collapses under its own weight. And while his world shrank, mine expanded. I took my savings, the money he never knew existed, and put it to use with care. I furnished my new apartment not extravagantly, but with things that reflected me. Soft colors, books stacked on shelves, plants in the windows catching the morning light. I booked a short trip for myself, the first in years, walking along cobbled streets in a new city where no one knew my past, tasting food without guilt, buying myself a scarf just because I liked the way it felt around my shoulders. For the first time, every decision was mine, unfiltered, untouched by anyone's smirk or dismissal. I even reconnected with an old colleague who asked me to consider consulting part-time, and the thrill of using my skills again, of being valued for my mind, reminded me of who I had been before I let him shrink me down. There were nights when I sat by the river, notebook open, and thought about the years I had lost. But instead of bitterness, I felt gratitude, because those years had taught me the importance of protecting myself, of listening to the quiet voice that said, save, prepare, trust yourself. That voice had been right all along. The greatest twist of all was that his smirk, the very thing he used to belittle me, had been my motivation, my fuel. Without it, maybe I never would have built my secret, never would have found the strength to leave. In the end, it wasn't the account that ended it all. It was my decision to stop letting his arrogance define me. And as I walked forward into a life shaped only by my choices, I realized that the real ending wasn't his downfall. It was my beginning. The strangest part of freedom was how normal it began to feel. At first, every decision felt monumental. Buying a new lamp for the living room, signing my own name on a lease, cooking dinner exactly the way I liked without someone rolling his eyes or smirking at the portion sizes. But as weeks turned into months, the extraordinary settled into the ordinary. And I realized that this was how life should have always been. Mine. I no longer had to explain purchases, no longer had to brace for arguments over bills, or defend my career choices. The money in my account wasn't just numbers, it was safety. It was proof that I could trust myself. And slowly, the woman who had once been made small began to take up space again. I said yes to invitations without asking permission. I bought myself flowers on random Tuesdays. I stayed out late laughing with friends I hadn't seen in years. Every piece of my old self I reclaimed felt like a victory. Meanwhile, his decline was no longer whispered, but visible. He had sold the flashy car that once defined his ego, moved into a small apartment he pretended was temporary, and picked up work that didn't fit the image he used to project. People noticed. The same acquaintances who once praised his ambition now shook their heads, muttering that he had burned too many bridges. And though some tried to drag me into the gossip, I stayed above it because I didn't need to celebrate. His fall, my life was already celebration enough. The irony was, he had always thought I needed him to survive. But it was he who had depended on me, on my silence, on my sacrifices, on my steady hands holding the seams of his unraveling world together. And when I withdrew those hands, when I stepped back, his world collapsed. My secret account had been the lifeboat, but my courage to use it was the true salvation. Sometimes, late at night, I caught myself remembering his smirk, the tilt of his lips, the glint in his eyes, but it didn't sting anymore. If anything, it made me smile, because that smirk was the spark that lit the fire in me, the reminder that arrogance can't erase preparation, and underestimation can't erase quiet strength. He once smirked at the thought of me quitting my job for us. Now I smiled at the thought of having quit him for me. By the time a year had passed, I hardly recognized the woman I had been when this all began. Back then, I measured my worth through his approval, shrinking myself every time his smirk cut me down. Now, I measured my days in peace, in the small joys that stacked up like bricks of a new foundation. Early mornings with sunlight spilling through my curtains, quiet evenings reading in bed, weekends spent exploring places I once thought I was too busy to enjoy. My secret account, once hidden like a weapon, had transformed into the seed of my independence. I invested carefully, watched it grow, and realized I no longer lived in fear of what if. If the car broke down, I could handle it. If the job shifted, I had options. That kind of security, built by my own discipline, felt better than any gift he ever gave me. Meanwhile, his decline was complete. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that he'd been let go from his last position, his arrogance finally catching up with him. The smirk that once carried him through rooms no longer worked when his reputation preceded him as reckless and unreliable. He had become exactly what he once mocked in others: desperate, small, irrelevant. And while he tried to spin excuses, blaming the economy, bad luck, or even me, no one was buying it anymore. The truth was plain. He had wasted everything, including me. And I had chosen to stop being wasted. The final time I saw him, purely by accident in a cafe downtown, he looked older, worn, and when our eyes met across the room, I braced for that smirk. But it didn't come. Instead, there was a flicker of something else. Recognition. Maybe even regret. And in that moment, I realized I didn't need it anymore. His smirk had once defined my pain, but now its absence defined my freedom. I turned back to my coffee, my notebook open, plans for the future spilling across the page. Because in the end, it was never really about ending him. It was about ending the version of me who believed I had to stay. And that ending was the most beautiful beginning of all. The true victory revealed itself not in his downfall, but in the life I built afterward, a life where his name was nothing more than a closed chapter. I stopped checking for updates about him, stopped listening when people tried to bring him up, because I realized I didn't need the comparison anymore. My life was no longer defined by what he lost, but by what I gained. I poured my energy into work that fulfilled me, the kind of projects I used to dream about but always pushed aside to manage his chaos. I started traveling more. Small trips at first, then bigger ones. Each journey a reminder that I wasn't tethered to anyone's. Arrogance. In Florence, I stood in front of paintings I had only studied in books, marveling at the brush strokes. In Lisbon, I sipped coffee on a balcony overlooking tiled rooftops, thinking how impossible that freedom would have seemed back when I couldn't even buy groceries without explaining myself. Every step was proof of my resilience. Back home, my circle grew. Friends, old and new, filled my weekends with laughter. Not the forced, brittle kind from dinner parties where I played the supportive wife, but real, unfiltered joy. I found myself saying yes more often, not to please anyone, but because I wanted to. And through it all, the echo of his smirk faded further and further, until it became something I could recall without pain, like an old scar that no longer throbbed. If anything, it fueled gratitude. Gratitude that I had listened to my instincts, that I had trusted the quiet voice urging me to save, to prepare, to protect myself. Gratitude that I had chosen myself over his ego. And one night, standing on my balcony with a glass of wine in hand, the city lights twinkling below, I whispered aloud the truth I had carried silently for so long. I wasn't the woman who quit her job for us. I was the woman who built a secret, account for me. And that choice, more than anything he ever gave or took, was the reason I was free. Freedom became less about escape and more about creation. I wasn't just surviving without him anymore. I was thriving, designing a life that felt like mine in every corner. I redecorated my apartment in colors he would have hated, bold and warm, filling shelves with books and memories instead of his trophies and meaningless gadgets. I planted herbs on the balcony, the smell of rosemary and basil drifting through my windows on summer evenings. And each time I clipped a sprig for dinner, I smiled at how simple happiness could be when no one was smirking over your shoulder, belittling your joy. I began writing again, something I had abandoned years ago, when every hour was spent smoothing over his chaos. At first, it was only scribbles in a notebook, late at night with a cup of tea, but soon the words turned into essays, stories, and eventually articles that were published in places I once dreamed of contributing to. Seeing my name in print, not his, not ours, but mine alone, made me feel more powerful than any victory in court ever could. People asked if I had started dating, and I laughed. Not because I didn't believe in love, but because I finally understood. I didn't need it to feel whole. I had already proven to myself that I was enough. And while whispers of him still floated around, how he had taken another job and lost it, how he was seen out with someone new who didn't last long, I realized those whispers no longer mattered. They weren't mine to carry. They were echoes of a story I no longer lived in. What mattered was that I had rewritten my own, one decision at a time, with every deposit I once made in secret now transformed into a deposit of confidence, of independence, of peace. And when I thought back to the woman who once stood in front of him saying, "I quit my job for us," I no longer felt shame. I felt compassion for the woman who believed him and pride for the woman who outgrew him. His smirk had ended nothing. My secret account had ended everything. And what began after that was not revenge, but rebirth. Sometimes I wonder if he ever truly understood the moment everything shifted, the exact second his smirk lost its power. Was it when the bank froze the accounts? When the lawyer slid the evidence across the table? Or was it when he walked into court expecting me broken and instead found me steady, prepared, untouchable? I'll never know, because I stopped looking for answers in him the day I realized the only answers I needed were in me. What I do know is this: the life I live now bears no resemblance to the one I left behind. My days are filled with choices that are mine alone. My nights are quiet in the best way. And every time I glance at my savings, growing steadily with each careful step, I feel the satisfaction of having built something no one can take from me. He thought smirking was strength, that belittling me gave him power, but true strength was found in patience, in silence, in the discipline to prepare while he wasted. And when the reckoning came, he had nothing left but excuses while I had freedom. That is what he'll never understand, that the woman he dismissed as dependent turned out to be the only one capable of surviving without him. The ending isn't just a neat closing of a chapter, it's a tapestry woven from every silent decision I ever made, every late night when I chose not to confront him, but instead to file away another piece of evidence, every grocery run where I pocketed a small bit of cash for myself, every humiliation I endured at dinner tables where he made me. The punchline, and I responded with a polite smile, hiding the fire that was quietly building inside me. People often expect a dramatic finish when they hear a story like mine. They imagine me standing in a courtroom shouting or slamming doors as I storm out of the house with bags packed. But the truth of my revenge was quieter, sharper, more enduring. It wasn't one single act that ended him. It was 1,000 deliberate, patient acts of survival, each one stacking on top of the other until the day came when the weight of them collapsed the world he thought he controlled. That is what he'll never understand. His smirk was powerful, only because I allowed it to be, because I gave him space to believe his arrogance was strength. But the day I stopped allowing it, the day I let my silence turn into strategy, his smirk began to die. And the final blow wasn't loud. It was watching him unravel in real time, powerless against the very discipline he mocked. When I look back now, what strikes me most is how long I lived under the shadow of that smirk. It became the backdrop of my life. The way he'd curl his lips when I suggested we budget more carefully, the way his eyes gleamed when he teased me in front of his friends, the way he dismissed my career as if it were a hobby. That smirk was a weapon, sharpened on my sacrifices. But what he didn't know was that every cut he thought he delivered was another stitch in the safety net I was weaving. He thought I quit my job for him. In reality, I quit the illusion of us the moment I made that first deposit into my secret account. I didn't realize it at the time, but each small transfer was a vow to myself that I would never be left with nothing, that no matter how much he smirked, I would always have the power to walk away. And that vow carried me through the darkest nights, through the loneliness of being belittled in my own home, through the silence of sitting across from him at dinner, knowing he was lying and choosing not to call him out. I wasn't weak. I was waiting, and waiting became my strongest weapon. The day it all came to light felt almost surreal. He walked into court with that same old smirk, confident that I would crumble, that the woman who once gave up her paycheck for him would surely buckle under the weight of divorce. But he hadn't prepared. Not really. He had lived too long in the world of his own ego, believing that charm and arrogance could erase numbers, that gaslighting could rewrite history. What he didn't realize was that I had the numbers. I had the history, and I had the receipts, all carefully stored, organized, undeniable. And when my lawyer slid that folder across the table, I saw it in his eyes. The moment arrogance met reality. His smirk twitched, faltered, and then vanished. Not slowly, not gracefully, but in an instant, because there is no mask strong enough to cover the shock of being beaten at your own game. He had underestimated me for so long that the truth landed like a knockout punch. In that moment, I didn't feel vindictive. I felt free, because the power dynamic we had lived in for years had shifted completely. The man who mocked my carefulness, who laughed at my savings habits, who thought my silence meant ignorance, was now at the mercy of the woman he once dismissed. But the real ending wasn't in that courtroom. The real ending was in the life That followed. The quiet mornings in my own apartment, where I brewed coffee without hearing his voice, criticized the brand I bought. The long afternoons where I worked on projects that reignited my career, no longer apologizing for ambition. The evenings spent with friends, laughing freely, realizing how much of myself I had muted to keep him comfortable. It was in the trips I took, walking alone through cities where no one knew me as his wife, only as myself, savoring every taste, every sight, every moment of independence. It was in therapy sessions where I peeled away the years of self-doubt. He had layered onto me, rediscovering the woman I had been, before his smirk overshadowed my confidence. Each of these moments was a piece of my new story, a story not defined by his downfall, but by my rebirth. And yet, I won't pretend there isn't satisfaction in knowing how far he fell. The man who once bragged about his success, now scraping together side jobs. The man who once laughed at my savings, now drowning in debts he can't escape. The man who once weaponized his smirk, now unable to summon it when he sees me. Because, yes, I did see him one last time, by chance in a cafe. He looked up, expecting, perhaps, to wield that same old expression that had once made me feel small. But it wasn't there. Instead, I saw exhaustion, defeat, and something I never thought I'd see in his eyes. Recognition. Recognition that I had outsmarted him, that the woman he underestimated had been 10 steps ahead all along. He looked at me as though he wanted to say something, maybe to ask for pity, maybe to reach for the version of me who used to put him first. But she was gone. I was not that woman anymore. I simply turned back to my coffee, opened my notebook, and wrote another page in a life that was mine alone. So no, the ending isn't about him losing. The ending is about me winning. Not in the petty sense, but in the profound sense of reclaiming everything he tried to take from me. My secret account wasn't just money, it was faith in myself, preserved through years of being told I wasn't enough. It was proof that even when I doubted, a part of me always knew I deserved more. And when I finally acted, when I finally turned that hidden strength into freedom, I didn't just end a marriage. I ended the cycle of being diminished, the cycle of giving and receiving nothing in return. That's what real revenge looks like. Not screaming, not destroying, not humiliating, but walking away whole, walking away prepared, walking into a future where the smirk that once haunted me has no power at all. And so the final image isn't of him slouched in defeat, though I could paint it easily enough. The final image is of me, standing in the sunlight outside that courthouse, papers in hand, the city alive around me, breathing in freedom like it was the first breath I had ever taken. The smirk was gone, my smile remained, and it was mine.